Okay. Good evening, everyone. It's already our 15th leadership talk, and I have a special pleasure to host tonight a friend of mine and a fellow of McCain Institute NGL, Kateryna Smagliy from Ukraine. Kateryna is an activist, a scholar from Ukraine, who works for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs right now of Ukraine. She worked previously as the head of the McCain Institute in Kiev office. She teaches several universities across Ukraine, and she is really passionate about providing students from Eastern occupied territories with a chance for decent education, undergrad, postgrad education in a period which has been for last 6 years very difficult for them. Kateryna, thank you very much for spending some time to share with the Montenegrin and Balkan public a little bit of insight from your leadership journey. Good evening and hello.
Thank you, Lubo. It's great to see you, and let me congratulate you with this wonderful initiative that you launched. I think it is very timely, and I already seen a lot of NGLs who've been part of your debates online. It's always great to hear their stories and to connect in these difficult times of COVID-19. Before we begin, let me just make one correction in your introductory statement, because I don't work for the Foreign Ministry per se. I work for the Diplomatic Academy of Ukraine, which is part of the Foreign Ministry, but I'm not a diplomat. I belong to the group of scholars who support the development of Ukraine's diplomatic corps. So this is important detail.
To clarify, yes, it's important to clarify. Thank you very much for this. Katya, we've been through this for a year, and this is a very important but very familiar subject for you. I wanted to ask you the first question I ask almost every single guest of mine about your personal values. So what are some of the personal values that you cherish the most? Where are those values coming from? Where do you see them coming from your education, from family? I know that you come originally from the part of the Ukraine that is now under occupation. So if you can share with us those details, we can start from there.
Thank you, Lubo. Indeed, my father comes from Eastern Ukraine, from Donbass. That is why the project that I implement now with the McCain Institute is closely connected with that region. As you remember, in 2015, almost immediately after the Russia-supported rebels, quote unquote, seized control of some eastern parts of Ukraine, some displaced universities, which used to be on the territory of Donetsk and Lugansk Oblast, moved to Ukraine. And because I care deeply about those students, I organized several schools of democracy and leadership for them. And that is how my project was selected for the McCain Institute Next Generation Leaders Program. I must say that my participation in this program has changed my understanding of leadership a lot. And of course, the personality of John McCain himself has had a great impact on how I understand leadership, how I think about leadership, because I must confess that there is not a single day in my life that I spend without thinking and deeply thinking about what leadership is, how we understand it, and how we as McCain Institute NGL set up a new standard for our society, for our smaller communities, and for our countries at large. I read and reread this wonderful book by John McCain, which I recommend strongly to everyone who is interested in leadership, in addition to his very last book, The Restless Wave, where he talks about maybe the last 10 years of his political career and his senatorial career. he talks in this book about character, and he repeatedly stated in the past that he is a strong believer in character, and character built and based on values such as honesty, respect, authenticity, loyalty, dignity, courage, diligence, cooperation, self-control, confidence, etc. The list is very, very long. But in my personal leadership journey, I realized that probably three personal values and three elements of character matter the most, especially in the region that we represent, Eastern Europe, Ukraine, which still very deeply rooted with all this post-Soviet, post-communist values, post-communist legacy. I believe for our leaders, courage is one of the top values, you know, that we must demonstrate as leaders, because it takes a lot of courage to fight with the old system, so to say. We often hear that Ukraine nowadays is fighting two wars, one with Russia and another one with the old system. The old system doesn't want to give up. You know, the institutional legacy of the communist regime is of closed societies in a general term is still very strong. So for leaders of the new cohort who want to see their societies changed, it is very important to have this courage to speak up, to lead by example, and to initiate deep and lasting change. The second value and the second character, part of character, which I believe is extremely important, is resilience. Because many leaders whom I personally know, who started the process of reforms in the past immediately after the Revolution of Dignity, probably didn't have enough resilience to keep going with their vision of change. Maybe the system broke them down, so in a year or two they departed from government. They realized that it's too hard to fight with this big monster which doesn't want to change. So resilience is a quality that has to stand with us, not only for a year or two, for months or two. It has to be inside of us for years and maybe decades, just as with Senator McCain, you know, who had a vision for American society, for American values, and he fought for those values all his life. And the value which I strongly believe in is generosity and fairness. We see that, personally, I believe that Ukraine's society nowadays is very unfair still. You know, there are people who are very rich, there are people who are very poor. The government is predominantly male-dominated, so there is not even fairness and justice in the sphere of gender equality. We see that some regions of Ukraine are better off. Others, like the east of Ukraine, their interests sometimes are mostly neglected. So this value of fairness, justice, social justice, equality, and generosity, where we as leaders share all the wealth, our national wealth, our intellectual ways, equally with everyone who calls himself or herself a citizen of this society. This is, of course, a vast and enormous subject that you've touched, but for Ukraine nowadays, I believe that those three values are most important.
You answered my question, which I was thinking to ask you a bit later, but you answered it perfectly right. So this is the main problem that we're facing in the transitional culture is that we are fighting the wars that are not the wars with others, but wars which are fighting with ourselves, just like on a personal level. This legacy that keeps us rooted in an old system which was not merit-based, which was actually based on partitocracy, on stolen institutions, on corruption, and etc. So this is why it is important that the project that you've been doing, the idea that you've been implementing through your leadership action plan is that you want to have at the end of your leadership action plan, first accredited curriculum on Ukrainian university that deals exclusively with leadership. I stole your idea. So I'm trying to, as you know, that I was trying, not me personally to implement it, but I wanted to inspire somebody who is a scholar, just like yourself, to do the same here in the Balkans. I think it is very important to change, to initiate, to invigorate the change of the culture within one society. Just as you know that culture eats strategy, just as you know that culture is strategy for breakfast. Can you tell us a little bit more if there are some values based and rooted in Ukrainian tradition that are not the negative ones, but there are some values, and I'm sure you're aware of them, that can be used to help and support this change that you need and we need all these societies. So what would those values be? What are those positive values in Ukrainian culture that can help you on your journey, on your leadership action plan?
Well, Ukraine probably one of those unique nations among all post-Soviet states, which has demonstrated clearly that it is a very freedom-loving nation. We already had in the last 30 years 3 democratic revolutions. One which took place in the early 19th, the revolution on the granite, so to say. It was a revolution which took place in the downtown of Kiev with just 100 students who started a protest against the government, which was still comprised of too many representatives of the communist regime. Then the second revolution, which was called and is now known in history as Orange Revolution by the colors of the then presidential candidate Viktor Yushchenko. It was already much bigger social uprising and political uprising against fraudulent elections and all these machinations related to elections which had been conducted by his opponent Viktor Yanukovych. It took place in 2004. And finally, the very last revolution of dignity, which took place in 2013, 2014, lasted for 3 months. That is why I'm so sympathetic with our brothers in Belarus, who are now fighting on the streets, you know, almost as long as Ukrainians did, although our revolution took place in the winter times in the very harsh under very harsh weather conditions, but Belarus demonstrates the same level of perseverance and courage, etc. So Ukrainians are very freedom-loving. It's a very democratic society, yes, they have demonstrated, you know, that there are values for which they will always stand. You know, the Ukrainian society is fighting rigorously against corruption. Unfortunately, this war with corruption has not been fully won, but I believe that this strong desire to see Ukraine as a democratic society which is based on the rule of law and guided by principles of social justice, mutual responsibility will finally prevail.
I hope so. The question I wanted to ask you, yeah, I hope so, just not just for Ukraine, but also here we are experiencing the political changes that are happening. But unfortunately, the culture is not changing. So then culture makes all those people with good intentions and good habits that to lose their passion for change in just a couple of years, not just a couple of years, just a couple of months after they take power. The next question is a little bit down to earth. It's connected to organizations that you worked for. I know that you are a just person, that you really stand for your values, and that you can't, you are not able to not to speak true to the power. Let's put it that way. So we've learned that when we have opposing or not aligning personal and organizational values, that we are somehow, our creativity is blocked. Our gift, our focus on goals and giving the best of ourselves to the organization is somehow closed. It's jailed within us because we are focusing not to show our discontent. So can you tell us a little bit, if you have an example, it would be good. If not, can you tell us about this importance? How do you see this importance? Is this this change that we were talking about on the national level, does it start with organizations we are working for?
Sure, and to kind of to connect the dots, you know, from where I just ended to where I had 3 revolutions, which had been based on very good ideals, on very good aspirations, very good kind of feelings, positive feelings for the future of Ukraine. But somehow these positive feelings, they cannot put root into Ukraine's institutions. So this institutional change, which is a task which much longer, you know, than just a revolution. The revolution may last for a week or several months, but then it will take several years to change institutions so that the whole country, the whole society, and the whole government operates in the right way. I don't want to talk about the institution which I currently represent, because it would be a demonstration of not. I may be seen as not a very loyal person, you know, and I don't want to be very specific in this regard, but I can generally share with you some observations about Ukraine's government in general, about Ukraine's political class in general. What truly troubles me is that in Ukraine, the society, which sometimes is too individualistic, you know, we cannot build teams, good teams. We cannot trust our colleagues and share credit for successful projects when they're implemented. We're very quick to blame our opponents for something that went wrong. But when things go well, we cannot share credit with all the individuals who participated or who contributed to the good result which had been achieved. I'm also concerned that Ukrainians do not use history to provide perspective. You know, we're a very young state. We're only next year we will celebrate 30 years of our independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we'll now already have the 6th president. And surprisingly, every new president that is selected, brought to power, starts his policies from the criticism of his predecessor. So everything which was done by the predecessor was necessarily wrong. Although, as we understand, this is not true. There have been good things and there have been bad things. And unfortunately, because we are not able to build up on positive example, we somehow destroy all the good achievements, and all the time we start anew. This is a horrible, feature of the national character. I always concerned by the fact that many politicians in my country, they refuse to let past resentments fester. You know, they use politics for personal vendettas quite often, and they start their political future by criticizing, as I said, their predecessor. This has to change. You know, there is no future for Ukraine unless we build a national consensus, even with those who oppose you, even politically. Unfortunately, in Ukraine's political and state institutions, there is no standard for mutual respect and dignity. When someone is in power, he or she believes that the very position that he or she occupies makes him somehow a better person, or maybe a smarter person, which is not necessarily the case. People get to their position in a different way, and quite often not based on merit, but based on connections. But I can understand that a person can get a position based on connections and based on other considerations and merit. But then when such a person gets into position of power, he or she should become very inclusive and demonstrate mutual respect with all members of the team, and understand that different members of the team can represent different ideas, different innovative approaches, so they will enrich their understandings, their knowledge, their perspective will enrich organization. The society and institution must become much more inclusive rather than exclusive. Well, finally, maybe, in leadership, we have two types of leadership: transactional leadership and transformational leadership. And transactional leadership is basically quid pro quo. We decide with you to move forward. If, I give something to you, you give something back to me. Transformational leadership is a type of leadership which inspires your followers to go after you, irrespective of whether or not you have something transactional involved in this process. I believe that for the countries like ours to succeed in the process of reforms, both types of leadership have to be used. Sometimes, yes, you have to rely on transactional leadership, but when you apply transactional leadership, transformational leadership should also be present. Unfortunately, in Ukraine, especially when we look at the political spectrum, I feel that transactional leadership prevails. The idea of transformative leadership might occupy maybe 5 or even 3% of politicians' thinking, their rationale when they inspire reform. That is still very kind of quid pro quo situation, which is even now demonstrated by how Ukraine got involved all of a sudden into this crisis with Donald Trump's administration and, the famous, or better to say, infamous telephone call between President Zelensky and President Trump in July last year.
I understand completely. The part where you said that when you emphasize the need for the institutions to have institutional memory, that not everything good ends with the former leader or official, and everything bad starts with the new one, and vice versa. There is a good example I just wanted to share a comment with you. We had in Kyrgyzstan a few days ago this happening is another revolution. So it was a custom, their habit, that every new government was putting the old government in. They also had three or four revolutions since 2000s, early 2000s. So now we had the situation where two of the previous government leaders were released from jail, and now they are on the streets fighting together, even though one of them put the other one into jail. So it's quite changing. So this is interesting. This kind of we talked about here in Montenegro. We talked a lot about the about this revanchism, what we call it, revanchism, or retaliation towards the past governments, which always has this personal touch sometimes. So Katya, you answered almost all questions that I had to ask you, and the last question, and I know that you have a lot of on your agenda and on your mind, so I wanted to ask you a very important question about some of the examples, people, leaders that you worked for, or that you have respect for. You mentioned Senator McCain. Of course, this stands for, I think, all of us that applied and had luck to go through the whole of the program. But what are some other leaders that you would like us to know about, that have inspired you to do the good work you're doing?
Well, as you remember, when this very question was put to all of us in Washington, D.C., when we were asked to present the leader who inspires us, I talked about Mustafa Dzhemilov, a Crimean leader, head of Crimean Majlis, who was a dissident during the Soviet times, who continuously fought for Crimean identity, who spent many years in Soviet camps, who came into history as an individual who spent the most number of days on hunger strike in protest of unfair treatment of Crimean Tatars in the Soviet Union, and who unfortunately is now unable to visit Crimea because the occupant regime of Russia, put him on the list of persona non grata. As a leader of Crimean Tatars, he is no longer able to go to Crimea, and this very strong sense of courage, perseverance, strong ethical values, that what inspires me in Mustafa Dzhemilov and many Ukrainian dissidents who under the Soviet regime fought for Ukraine's independence, for Ukraine's national identity, even for our right to speak our native language, the Ukrainian language, as you say. But now I want to encourage everyone who watches us today to look into the example of American presidents. I've just finished translating a wonderful book by Doris Kearns Goodwin, which is called Leadership in Turbulent Times, and it is devoted to 4 American presidents: Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and Lyndon Johnson. These are 4 remarkable stories of 4 remarkable leaders with very specific examples of how they achieved change in American society at different point of time. So I'm now strongly inspired by those 4, having just read their stories and translating this in Ukrainian. I was so impressed by this book that I decided, to translate this book and to publish it in Ukrainian myself, so that more Ukrainians are informed about these leadership stories and get a better understanding of what true leadership, transformational leadership, visionary leadership, crisis management can mean for Ukrainian society today. So in addition to our own Ukrainian dissidents, yes, I make no secret that I'm a great fan of American leadership. I'm a great fan of such inspirational leaders as Abraham Lincoln, who managed to finish the Civil War in the United States, the example that we strongly need in Ukraine right now. There are many insights of how you finish a conflict like this on your soil, how you ensure that peace talks between the rebellious South and North, are accomplished successfully. That there is no vendetta, as we just discussed. That you preserve the republic and you make sure that it goes out of the war stronger, not weaker. So this is extremely important for Ukraine now, and I'm looking forward for the day when my book, translated by me, will be published.
Unfortunately, I don't speak Ukrainian, but I'll read the original version, I promise. I'll try to find it.
You will love it. You will love it, Liba.
I will, especially with President Lincoln. You remember that while we were there, the book that was at the time, that was just freshly published, that was The Team of Rivals, and it talked about his willingness to invite in his team people that were up until that moment his opponents, and let's say enemies, his political enemies, to come and invest themselves in the government in the time of crisis for the nation. So that's quite an exceptional his feature of his character, just as you said, that showed why he was an authentic leader and leader of change. Katya.
Exactly, Lubo, exactly.
Thank you very much for speaking with me today. It was short, but it was informative, as always with you. Дякую, and thank you very much once again, and hope to see you and speak to you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Lubo. All the best to you, to your project, and to all Montenegrins who are the great friends of the people of Ukraine, as courageous and freedom-loving as we are. All the best.
Thank you. Дякую.